Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Future in Heart Failure, Novel Therapies, Innovative Trial Designs, and Stakeholder Diversity. My name is Colleen Lezovitz, and I'm a Senior Marketing Manager at Worldwide Clinical Trials. Before we kick things off, I did want to go over a few things. All attendees are on mute, but please use the questions window to submit questions at any time pertaining to the presentation, because we will be reserving time for a Q&A session at the end. This webinar is being recorded, and all attendees will receive an email with a link to access the on-demand, so keep an eye out for that either tomorrow or Monday. At this time, I would like to hand things over to our Chief Medical and Scientific Officer, Dr. Michael Murphy. Dr. Murphy?
Good morning. Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Murphy. I'm Chief Medical and Scientific Officer for the company. It's a pleasure to introduce you to two interesting themes in the arena of cardiovascular research. And the first one is going to be a topic dealing with emerging heart failure therapies and trial designs. In the midst of innovation in drug discovery, there is a mandate for innovation in trial operations and experimental design. My good colleague Tony Bransford will be taking the lead on that one. I'm going to be addressing a companion and I hope equally interesting initiative that basically says in the midst of therapeutic novelty, we also need to generate data that would allow the industry to compete on value. Kind of sub rosa, sometimes novel makes me nervous. So what are the data constructs? What's the framework for clinical development that would actually promote the best therapy for the best patient in the most economical fashion? Each of our topics is fairly comprehensive in scope. We've selected certain themes to emphasize differentially. The orientation today is from the perspective of an individual that might be involved with design, trial operations, methods of analysis and interpretation. Our presentation will last approximately 50 minutes, and we hope there is an opportunity for Q&A. Now, Tony and I thought it was best to start out, understanding the audience better. We have such a large audience, and I assume quite diverse. So if you could, Colleen, show the first question to the attendees. So how many of you listening in are actively engaged in discovery or development research in acute or chronic heart failure? So the choices are, which you need to click on, you're actively engaged in one or both. You're not engaged in either, but your organization, which might be a company or an academic institution, is considering these initiatives. And then finally, how many of you are not involved with either, but you're interested in the topic? If you could please check the dot, please, and we'll take a look at the results in a minute. Okay. Okay, interesting split. Well, Tony, we have our work cut out for us. So with that as an introduction, Tony, may you please take the next step with the topic.
Well, thank you, Mike. Yes, that was a very interesting split there. So my name is Tony Bransford, and this has not moved forward yet. I'm a Senior Medical Director with Worldwide Clinical Trials. Colleen, maybe you can help me. Oh, there we go. Okay. So again, Tony Bransford. I'm a Senior Medical Director with Worldwide Cardiovascular, Worldwide Clinical Trials. I'm a cardiologist by training, having worked for years in the academic sector before joining the pharmaceutical industry for over a decade, and now as a consulting cardiologist, Senior Medical Director with Worldwide Clinical Trials. But let's go into a different polling question, Colleen, if you please. So this question starts us off with just some basic information about heart failure. So what is first and second line therapy for treating heart failure? Please select one. Valsartan, enalapril, sacubitril, A and C, or none of the above. And actually, the question here is unfortunately it was transcribed incorrectly. It should be, what is first line therapy for treating heart failure? Okay, so very interesting. And I'll tell you, first-line therapy for treating heart failure based on the ACC, AHA, and even the European Society of Cardiology guidelines is enalapril. You were correct. Valsartan was not correct. Everyone was correct that sacubitril is not first-line therapy. However, valsartan and sacubitril together are also not first-line therapy. They can be used as an alternative to ACE inhibition if the patient does not improve with ACE inhibitors or becomes intolerant of the ACE inhibitor. Thank you, Colleen. So we're going to go ahead and talk about emerging failure therapies and trial design. But in order to understand that, let's back up just a moment and take a quick sojourn into heart failure. So cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death in the Western world and affects nearly 6.6 million people over the age of 18 in the U.S. alone, with an additional 3 million new cases expected by 2030. Now that's an approximately 25% increase from the year 2010. And data from the CDC states that about 5.1 million people in the U.S. have heart failure. Chronic heart failure is a complex clinical syndrome with varying pathophysiological and clinical manifestations. Now, symptoms are primarily consistent with left heart failure, with dyspnea, including orthopnea and paroxysmal nocturnal dyspnea, being the cornerstone for presenting symptoms of heart failure. Now, there's also right heart failure with leg swelling and hepatic distension due to the backflow of fluid from the left heart into the right heart and ultimately into the venous system. Finally, the reduced cardiac output is manifested as an unrelenting fatigue. Now, on the other hand, signs of heart failure can be seen as pulmonary congestion on chest X-ray, including curly B lines, elevated jugular venous pressure, also known as jugular venous distension, and extra heart sounds, such as S3, which is the blood trying to push into a heart that is already overloaded with fluid and thus acting more like a box than an expandable balloon. There's also the S4, which is known as the atrial kick, as the heart is ardently trying to top off the blood in the ventricle with more blood, not realizing that it is already fluid overloaded. So the rate of disease progression is dependent both on the primary pathology and the activity of the compensatory processes, the most important of these being neural, endocrine, renal, and morphological. Now, most of these chronic compensatory processes, such as activation of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system and sympathetic nervous system, are believed to be harmful. However, the increase in natriuretic peptides is believed to be a beneficial compensatory response. And thus, modifying these compensatory mechanisms has been the cornerstone of heart failure medical therapy since the standard of care was developed back in the 1990s. The first line in heart failure treatment is RAS inhibition, or the inhibition of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, and specifically ACE inhibition, as the first agent that was able to conclusively show a reduction in mortality and heart failure hospitalizations. This, of course, was followed by beta blockade, which had fallen out of favor decades ago because of the increase in dyspnea seen in patients with acute heart failure. However, in better understanding the neurohormonal mechanisms, beta blockade has since become a cornerstone of therapy, with beta blockers inhibited leading to an initial decrease in contractility, which is why beta blockade is initiated slowly and carefully, and after the patient in acute heart failure has stabilized. but long-term leading to an improvement in myocardial contractility and reduction in cardiac events. However, there have been about 2 or more decades between beta blockade and the next agent that conclusively reduced mortality and heart failure hospitalizations. Sacubitril valsartan. Now notice that I didn't mention the MRAs, or mineralocorticoid antagonists, known as spironolactone. While both of these were shown to have a benefit in event reduction, there was never much uptake in the U.S., although a significant amount of uptake in physician usage has been seen in Europe. The lack of physician usage in the U.S. is most likely due to the side effect profile with excess hyperkalemia abounding. Now also notice that I did not mention ivabradine. While this can play a role in patients with heart failure and an elevated heart rate, it has not been shown to reduce mortality, but instead to only reduce heart failure hospitalizations. Thus, it is looked at as more of a niche therapy rather than as first, second, third line, or even an alternative to first line therapy like sacubitril valsartan. But with the advent of sacubitril valsartan and ivabradine, a new resurgence of interest in heart failure therapies has taken hold again. But the future of heart failure treatment will not be as simple as the past. Now we are not just inhibiting negative compensatory mechanisms or enhancing beneficial compensatory mechanisms. Nowadays we have to take it a step further. For instance, some of today's drug candidates are looking at off-target effects not traditionally assessed when evaluating for treatment. For instance, the pleiotropic effects of agents in the past, such as lipid agents, led to the unfortunately failed concept that statins could be used for more than lowering lipid levels. Now, despite the multitudinous effects it had, anti-inflammatory and others, this was not borne out in a reduction in clinical events. More recently, dipeptidyl peptidase 4 inhibitors, also known as DPP4 inhibitors or gliptins, are a class of oral hypoglycemic agents such as saxagliptin, alogliptin, which are currently being used to treat diabetes. However, recall that 2 decades ago, the health authorities determined that oral hypoglycemic agents must have, as part of their post-approval evaluation, multi-center studies with cardiovascular outcomes as the primary and secondary endpoints, primarily due to the rosiglitazone debacle that demonstrated an unacceptably high cardiovascular risk. As a result of this, saxagliptin from the SAVOR TIMI 35 trial and alogliptin from the EXAMINE trial were determined to need warning and precautions labeling that address the increased risk of death and heart failure hospitalizations, particularly in patients with a prior history of heart failure or kidney impairment. Yet the basic physiology of them is to modulate the activity of several cardioactive factors, including stromal cell-derived factor 1, SDF1, which has been shown to affect stem cell homing, decrease myocardial apoptosis, increase myocardial survival, myocyte survival, leading to cardiac repair in animal studies of acute MI and heart failure. So this would support the notion that the cardiovascular effects, whether positive or negative, may not be a class-specific phenomenon of DPP4 inhibitors. Indeed, a large population-based study with data from the FDA-funded Mini-Sentinel program failed to find an increase in heart failure hospitalizations relative to other diabetic agents, contradicting the SAVOR and EXAMINE trials. So further research into understanding the cardiovascular effects of this diabetic drug would represent major progress that could dramatically influence the management of cardiovascular disease. Now then there's personalized medicine. Now, personalized medicine is a medical procedure that separates patients into different groups, with medical decisions, practices, interventions, and or products being tailored to the individual patient based on their predicted response or risk of disease. This idea is a long time coming. For instance, the meta-iodobenzyl guanidine, or I-23-MIBG, is a norepinephrine analog that is taken up in cardiac sympathetic nerve endings. In heart failure, this uptake is decreased as norepinephrine stores in the myocardium are depleted. MIBG planar imaging can be used as a prognostic marker to assess for cardiovascular risk and prognosis in cardiac dysfunction. So, say a heart to mediastinum ratio greater than or equal to 1.6 has been shown to correlate with fewer cardiovascular events in patients with dilated cardiomyopathy, as seen in the ADMIRE-HF trial. Now, this was something looked at in an earlier era of nuclear SPECT imaging with thallium, but was clearly not performed nearly as elegantly as is being done now with the MIBG agent. In 2013, the FDA approved it for assessment of the HM ratio to assist in evaluation in dilated cardiomyopathy patients. But how will this be used? An ideal solution would be to look at how heart failure patients could benefit by being subgrouped into low and high risk. This is the crux of personalized medicine, to find better uses for devices or drugs that are already in use. Another example is the prognostic and diagnostic marker NT-proBNP. This marker is being used more and more in heart failure studies to both diagnose heart failure patients as well as stratify them into low and high risk. For instance, with sacubitril as well as other newer agents not yet approved, this marker has become a cornerstone for defining a higher risk patient population that could benefit better from medical therapy. And then there is the use of RNA to affect overproduction of disease-producing proteins. One of the first agents to be used in this manner in the cardiometabolic space is mipomersen, an antisense oligonucleotide designed to prevent overproduction of apolipoprotein B, the protein associated with LDL cholesterol. So this antisense oligonucleotide targets hepatocytes and thus is a good first effort. But future products should both target overexpression of disease-causing proteins as well as better target the hepatocyte, thus reducing side effects. Here we go. So how do we get there? We now need to look at the actual trial design and how to improve on this. But what can we learn from Sisyphus? Well, the definition of insanity is to keep doing the same thing expecting a different result. Something to think about for both Sisyphus and us as we design our cardiovascular trials. Now, in the 1990s, the unmet medical need was pretty substantial. Again, recall that in the 1990s there was the advent of the ACE inhibitor and also of aspirin use in cardiovascular disease. In the 2000s, there was the advent of beta blockers leading us into the present day with the additional armamentarium of the newest agents, as well as device therapy such as cardiac resynchronization therapy, intracardiac defibrillator therapy, newer diagnostic methods, and other treatment devices and methods, all coming together to reduce the unmet medical need over time. As you can see here, the sample size of cardiovascular trials is not so bad in the 1990s, and indeed, if we look at the ACE inhibitor trials, they were considered large in their day in the very early 1990s at around about 2,000 patients. And yet notice that as the unmet medical need decreases, trials require greater and even greater patient populations to achieve a more and more marginal effect size relative to placebo, or as we develop standards of care relative to first-line therapy. And if we look at the Vorapaxar program, those two sister trials were the largest cardiovascular trials of their time, with the TRA2P trial with greater than 26,000 patients randomized and the TRACER trial with almost 13,000. Now, the TRACER trial was terminated early, and TRA2P had one cohort discontinued early owing to the risk of intracranial hemorrhage. So Sisyphus, if he was smart, would tell us to stop rolling that rock up the hill and think of another way to determine if a drug is safe and efficacious while still trying to control for events. So we next want to look at developing novelty in our drug development plans to reach drug approval quickly, but with the same, if not better, evaluation of efficacy and safety as with the larger, more cumbersome trials. And if possible, it would be great to keep costs down while doing this. But this is not an easy task. While the health authorities are much more willing to discuss new and innovative trial design strategies, it still must be based on the science. It still must be able to detect safety signals, and it must not be too cumbersome to patients. Collaborating with the academic institutions and CROs can prove beneficial because these groups will have trialists that are well versed in designing trials of all types and styles and are familiar with what regulatory agencies want for efficacy and safety evaluation and for labeling. So starting with the end in mind, we'll focus on the endpoints and the statistical design. And for heart failure, the two most important events will be death and heart failure hospitalization. Now, data from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services state the U.S. national average readmission rate for heart failure patients is now 23%. So the readmission rate for heart failure patients is indisputably high, in part because heart failure is an extraordinarily complex disease and the underlying reasons for readmissions in heart failure patients encompass a host of factors. And if we look at the left side of this slide, you see that every time you have a heart failure hospitalization, the natural clinical course of the patient is that they will not recover to their previous health status. In fact, with each and every hospitalization, you see that the patient's clinical course continues its downward decline. And with the continued downward decline of the patient's clinical course and overall function and quality of life, mortality increases. So disease progression is marred by the patient's hospitalization. And as noted on the right, patients with more hospitalizations have a higher mortality rate. So for patients with this downward decline, such as seen in this heart failure patient, counting up all the events that mark the downward decline in the patient's clinical course, as in a recurrent or repeated events endpoint design, would be an alternative way to design that endpoint. And sure enough, if you look at the traditional heart failure trial design, you essentially ignore all events that occur after the first event as seen here in this first heart failure hospitalization. So indeed, in that time to first event design, up to 40% of events have been shown to be ignored in post hoc analyses of trials such as SHIFT and CHARM. SHIFT looking at the seminal ivabradine study, and CHARM, the much older study looking at heart failure with reduced, preserved, and using an alternative treatment strategy with candesartan. So as you can see in this slide, there is much more information that can be gathered and is used in a recurrent events design. By adding more information into the endpoint results, more data into the endpoints, you can have a more powerful treatment effect and potentially lower the sample size as a result. Now, some of the issues that have been discussed with the recurrent events design that you need to find a way to account for the event interaction that will invariably occur. So, for instance, if the endpoint is death and heart failure hospitalization, then the competing risk of death and heart failure hospitalization must be accounted for. First, because any admission with worsening heart failure accentuates the risk of death, and second, because dead patients can only die once and can no longer be admitted for additional hospitalizations. The power in this analysis comes from the additional information borne out in the excess of events. Additionally, a patient's risk increases with each hospitalization. However, a patient cannot have the second hospitalization until they have had the first hospitalization. They can't have had the third hospitalization before having the second hospitalization, and so on and so on. In addition, recurrent events tend to cluster in a subgroup of patients experiencing many more than the average number of hospitalizations during a given period of time. This is generally felt to be problematic with a recurrent events design, with that small fraction of patients contributing disproportionately to the overall burden of events. However, it is also true that if these individuals could be identified, they would be an appropriate target for more intensive monitoring and treatment. So other areas of novelty would include the type of trial designed. Now, if you compare a trial such as in the Vorapaxar program, the traditional endpoints as used in a traditional phase 3 trial and time to first events analysis leading to the TRA-2P trial would lead to the TRA-2P trial with ultimately over 20,000 patients randomized. Now, on the other hand, an analysis of recent trials brings us to the Paradigm HF trial. This was a phase 3 trial that did not follow a phase 2 trial. The rationale for this is reasonable in that it's almost like flipping a coin, the frequency of times that a successful phase 2 trial leads to a successful phase 3 trial. So if you look at some of the antiplatelet drug programs, you will see this concept played out again and again. So instead of a traditional phase 3 program, such as was seen in the Vorapaxar program as mentioned above, the Paradigm HF trial had a long run-in period for safety with stopping points at completion of a certain number of patients in the run-in period with DSMB evaluation, again for safety. Once a certain number of patients was reached, having completed the run-in period, the trial no longer required stopping enrollment for safety and could then continue unfettered from run-in period into the trial treatment period. The DSMB would continue to evaluate safety at certain enrollment numbers. Again, however, trial enrollment would no longer be stopped while evaluating safety. Now, another trial design is to combine a phase 2 and phase 3 program into one, with stopping between the phase 2 period and the phase 3 period for evaluation of data for safety, efficacy, since a portion of this is a phase 2 study, and a reevaluation of sample size based on the phase 2 treatment effect. So all of these alternatives to the traditional, large, cumbersome phase 3 time to first event trial design can either reduce the time to health authority approval or reduce sample size. But all of these have ways to reduce the overall cost of a development program. It's important to have academic and CRO partnering with the sponsor to define your strategy. For instance, the academic society can guide the trial design by helping to define what type of patient population would be most readily accepted. If the eligibility criteria defines a patient that doesn't need treatment as much as patients with different eligibility criteria, then the academic group will point this out to you. However, this must be taken with a caveat. Academics that are brought in on a consulting basis should be those that not only are experts in their own fields, but also are trialists, skilled in the design of the type of trial you are interested in. I say this because subject matter experts that do not have the experience of designing and conducting trials can also derail a trial and ultimately a drug development program because of their choices that are either too restrictive, thus not the right patients, and worse, an unenrollable trial, or a patient population that is not restrictive enough, and thus you don't have a high enough cardiovascular risk to generate a reasonable number of events over a certain period of time. So picking and choosing the academics that you work with is extremely important. They also must be easy to work with and have enough experience in trial design that they can be an effective partner in designing your trial, such as unpublished or to be published yet non-proprietary information that can assist the current trial in picking the right patient population. The wrong academics can make or break a trial, pushing the company to use the wrong endpoints found to be poorly associated with risk, and even more. Now, choosing the right CRO or contract research organization is also as important, if not more so. Many CROs have different features that set them apart from other CROs. For instance, some now have their own imaging and lab analysis that can set them apart. Others will have the internal experience to help in determining sites and understand the challenges ahead of time with recruitment and retention. Still others, highly skilled physician group used as consultants for companies similar to the type of consultation you would get from an academic trialist. This type of skilled physician group, when used in concert with a skilled operational group, can add much knowledge and know-how to your strategic advisory group. Finally, including an ARO or academic research organization can not only give you the scientific and trialist expertise you were looking for in the academic institutions, but can also support you with a lead investigator or study chair, as well as provide recommendations for the DSMB and CEC committees. And on the right, I actually have identified some of the premier AROs that perform most of the cardiovascular trials. Now let's take one last look at a polling question, and then we'll continue with my friend and colleague, Dr. Mike Murphy. How is a time to first event design different from a recurrent events design? So let's select one. Time to first event ignores information captured that can be captured in a recurrent events design. A recurrent events design identifies a subgroup that adds more events, that can contribute more events to the overall analysis. Recurrent events design can count events and measure the time between them, thus adding a layer of prognostic information important to the trial. Or 4, all of the above. Okay, and I see where almost everyone got the answer correct, all of the above. As mentioned above, the time to first event ignores up to about 40% of information that could be captured in a recurrent events design. What we consider to be a very good thing is that recurrent event design can identify a subgroup that can respond, that adds more events, but thus can also respond even better to the medication being offered in the study. And then the recurrent events design not only can count events, but can also measure the time from one event to the next, thus adding an extra layer of prognostic information. And now on to Dr. Mike Murphy.
Thank you so much, Tony. A great example of how innovation in drug discovery drives innovation in clinical development. And many of the concepts that Tony talked about today are actually quite fungible and will translate, interestingly, into other therapeutic areas. Of course, different outcomes, different issues, but the approach is really quite innovative and very exciting for those of us that do enjoy thinking through design and operational issues. So my particular topic is kind of a fun topic, and I added this little secondary expression on the bottom. Sometimes novel makes me nervous because it reflects a conversation I had a number of years ago with a good payer friend. He'd say, you know, Mike, you keep using that word novel. You know, we like novel. We encourage novel. We want innovative therapies on the market, but here's the problem we're having. Our experience is that innovative products are expensive products. They will displace inexpensive products, customarily with no evidence to actually suggest that they are materially different in patient outcomes, and frankly, some evidence to suggest that physicians will misuse it. So when you're out there talking to the colleagues, why not ask them to compete on the value of it and not only the novelty of it? So what follows in my few slides is an attempt to illustrate what I call sentiments, attitudes, ideas to incorporate in a program, again from the perspective of a trialist, reflecting diverse views, many different stakeholders, multidisciplinary team settings. I thought I'd introduce with the following image, which really reflects a feeling I've had doing this over 17 years. If I can get it to work, Colleen. There we go. So what's been the issue here? All the years we talk about this, sometimes the topic gets a very poor reception. Now, I'm not sure as to why. Perhaps it's a reflection of a concern that the mandate to demonstrate value in some fashion runs counter to the research and development mandate to demonstrate innovation. If I accomplish anything today, I'd just like to illustrate the fact that exactly the opposite is true. The mandate to demonstrate value requires that a trialist have the ultimate expression of the art, an ability to adjudicate and resolve, to design and implement, no less challenging than those of us that work in translational medicine. Indeed, in fact, this is translational medicine. We're moving from development into commercialization. And so all the tools of the trade that we all use to answer diverse questions need to be incorporated here, and I'll share a few that we think gets a lot of traction in heart failure. Now, Tony mentioned all the products in development, and I said to Tony, what an exciting time to be in cardiovascular research and development. I mean, the science is so permissive. It is really an exciting challenge to everyone involved in R&D to exploit the properties of these new agents in a fashion that, of course, gets approval, but also to make sure that we are competing in the process on the value and not just the novelty of the product. So, in fact, collaborative efforts, I really like this academic CRO and pharmaceutical collaboration. I think many of us that work in cardiovascular medicine realize that this is the model, this is the way to develop products, and we will see all of these stakeholders have remarkably different needs for data. Now, I enjoy showing this slide in different settings because it kind of illustrates the problem. Such a matrix out there, you know, very diverse stakeholders, and they're all impacting research and development activity at virtually every phase of clinical research. Every one of these stakeholders has a question of merit, is the way I would phrase it. Some question that will influence how a product is adopted, how it's placed in formulary, whether it receives any reimbursement as an example, and ultimately whether or not a patient has access. Now, the problem we have for those of us that assist in this type of research, it's not orderly. Sometimes I'm not even sure it's fully rational. But nevertheless, adjudicating these diverse interests is the art of effective clinical research. So we're going to do round robin here to show you different stakeholder sentiments, and then I'm going to offer some suggestions for consideration as you move ahead in a heart failure program. So, well, you know, Mike, we spoke to a stakeholder. Well, after doing this 17 years, my opinion is if you spoke to one payer, you have spoke to one payer. They're incredibly diverse. If we add an international perspective on this overlay, which is primarily U.S.-centric, then life really gets complex. The data requirements are all legitimate, but the problem is they're not all aligned. The content that they require in order to render a good decision on their plan is really quite different. And the sequence in which you need to approach the question is also very different. The overarching question, however, from every one of these stakeholders, I've listed a few on the side here, is how to incorporate novel technology into an ecosystem of care. That's the way to think of it, in which the introduction of any new agent will impact how healthcare is being delivered. So, in a way, we need to develop a database that speaks to a system-wide issue rather than a patient-level issue in order to have data which would resonate with this very interesting and diverse group of individuals. Now, what has their attention in heart failure? As Tony has indicated, wow, diverse mechanisms, usually small molecules, but certainly not exclusively. Some really remarkable innovation out there. And you know what I loosely refer to as one-and-done treatments, treatments that look like they might be applied only intermittently or maybe even only once, with the potential for some very long-term outcomes. This has everything from a payer's perspective. It has chronicity, it has comorbidities, it has maybe in some cases limited application of therapy. So it greatly increases the importance of calibrating the product's introduction into the marketplace using data, not opinion, that would tend to influence behavior. So that's the challenge we currently have, which is also quite exciting. Let's do a 360. I'm going to look at patient point of view, doctor's point of view, and a payer's point of view, and then from that derive some activities that we could entertain in R&D. So if we went out and did a survey of patients with heart failure, what are they anxious about? Well, it's money. Significant out-of-pocket cost. Every one of them is seeking cost savings, generally preferring generics over name brands, although there's some interesting literature in that regard, particularly for those of you that might work in the biosimilar space. Mostly pushing for lower dosages, and that could be a problem. Generic brands and fewer prescriptions. Well, what does this mean for us? What does it mean in the drug development program? It means that cost burden is a variable. It'll impact patient compliance. We all know that variation in compliance disproportionately accounts for variation in outcome. And therefore, one companion effort here is a patient and physician educational program, particularly for the therapies which are really out of the box and not traditional. What you feel, looking at the literature here, is that even as we have evolving standards for the approval of products, and that's really exciting too, we, in parallel, have changing evidentiary standards for value. What people perceive to be useful and valuable is shifting through times, and this is one stakeholder's, the patient perspective, that needs to be incorporated into a component of the development program in order to have success. What about from the physician's perspective? Well, many of my friends that work in marketing have lectured me on this over and over. Mike, mechanism of action nowadays may not actually prove to be a differentiation. And although KOL support for a product can be indispensable, it doesn't necessarily equate with physician adoption. And for a patient who's stable with heart failure, brand loyalty is everything. Introducing a new product in that particular setting might be extremely difficult, in fact, even medically not prudent. The bottom line is, for those of us in R&D, the gatekeepers for product introduction may not actually be the provider. It may be someone who's displaced from patient care. And as we all know, approval does not mean reimbursement and does not mean usage. So our mandate in the R&D space is to generate a set of data which would be resonate with this particular stakeholder. Basically, companion initiatives by development staff to inform commercialization. I'll show you what some of that might look like in a minute. What about from a payer's perspective? One cannot claim to speak for all payers because they're such a diverse group. But what might they see? I found an interesting example, if it comes up, Colleen, that gives you a sense. Here it is. Now, I don't vouch for the authenticity of this remark. I only offer it as an example of how the prism that is used to evaluate the data that you generated. I believe the payer will require prior authorization of this product and also requests, here it is, that the patient fulfill all of the criteria of the clinical trial. Now that trial included a population, this is a heart failure study, that was tolerant of full doses of ACE inhibitors. They did not have a lot of participants with comorbidities or renal insufficiency. There was very little data on patients over the age of 75, and the patients were not on a number of drugs. So the sentiment here is that although the study was beautifully designed and resulted in registration, the sentiment is, whether it's correct or not, is that it's artificial. It doesn't tell me about the real-world use of the product. It also reinforces a very common sentiment that you'll encounter in the space, is that the technique of piggybacking onto a registration study sometimes doesn't really scratch the itch. Now we're all doing this, we're all familiar with this. This is where you incorporate an economic question, a utilization question, onto a prototypical registration study. The doctors aren't actually representative. The patients surely are not representative. The measures are not representative in many cases. We constrain the dosing, the concomitant medication, the visit structure, the other physicians they may meet, and so forth. A piggybacking approach to answering the questions is not really going to be sufficient here. A companion initiative is required. But even in this space, there's some very clever and innovative approaches that companies have come up with for assisting in the introduction of an interesting product in heart failure. Here's one that I really liked, was performance-based price agreements. Really interesting. So in this case, a new oral product approved in heart failure patients with reduced ejection fraction, which, whereas Tony has indicated, heart failure hospitalization was a big primary endpoint. That becomes an index around which the price of the drug is now negotiated. It's an outcomes-based contracting model. They seized upon the primary and used the primary in order to dictate preferred formulary tier status and how much the copay would be for a given patient. So on the left-hand side, innovative just as innovative as we can be in trial design, the individuals that are responsible for formulary placement reimbursement decisions are equally clever in terms of how they're attempting to incorporate novel therapy into their portfolio. Now, on the right-hand side, this is our responsibility. Now, years ago, many of you that have been in the vineyard for a long time know that the idea of contributing to the compendia was really about influencing physician adoption. And yes, that is certainly true. A publication strategy to help illustrate product attributes so that physicians will write the prescription and adopt the product, critically important. Even more important nowadays, however, in my opinion, is a publication strategy that will also resonate with payers. Companion data that will speak to the utility of the product in real-world settings with real populations, with outcomes, not just measures, but outcomes which will translate into value proposition for their particular plan in their particular location. So, show me the money basically reflects upon, frankly, a willingness of payers in general to introduce novel drugs, but there are going to be some adjustments in terms of how that's done. And on the right-hand side, that's for all of us in R&D to make sure that we're contributing to a publication strategy along the way that will inform these decisions that need to take place once a product is introduced. Now, so what do we do here? So what do we do? So the first thing we have to do is recognize that there are different stakeholders. Now, as Tony has said, there's some very low-hanging fruit out there, and it happens to be around hospitalization. You can see that the drivers for the economics of congestive heart failure really are about hospitalization, and transformative therapies would really get everyone's attention. And if you orphanize the indication, that'll really get everyone's attention because of the recent literature that everyone is quite familiar with. But from a trials point of view, we need to acknowledge that in heart failure that there are regional differences in healthcare utilization. So the utilization that takes place in Louisiana, my home state, is not going to be the same as it is in California today. So where we place studies might influence the type of data and the type of inferences that might be allowed based upon the data that we derive. Direct cost is going to be a driver here. I know we all measure quality of life, and those are indeed workforce productivity, all interesting concepts. But at the end of the day, if we can't translate that into a difference in utilization and therefore cost, it won't have as much traction as we wish that it did. Comorbidities are moderating. Particularly in heart failure, it'll be diabetes. So including people with diabetes as an example and other comorbidities that might be drivers of outcome would be an important component of your trial. And we all know that in most studies that we do in development, we tend to reduce the level of comorbidities, we tend to reduce the level of concomitant medication because we're looking for signal detection so often, and we're trying to, so to speak, enhance the prospect for that. But we also need to attend to the fact that those patients that we're randomizing maybe are not the ones that are driving the utilization. Here's a fun sentiment that I frequently hear in some of the groups that I sit in. Send me my data, not your model. Now, in respect to all the models out there, and those are really interesting models, the way it would be expressed is if you place a study site in my integrated delivery network as an example, then I will have every single patient transaction that took place for that patient, not only for doing your study, but actually before your study probably and after your study. I can look at the entire consequence of that patient being in your study or not being in your study, so to speak, and that would be a really interesting data point for me. Finally, for the innovative therapy, if those of you in development need to be anxious about what I call the free rider challenge. If it's really innovative and really transformative, and you have a limited application with long-term benefit, well, if you thought about it for a second, the individual that's paying for the treatment may not be the organization that's accruing the benefit. The treatment occurs early, the benefits come later. This has to do with, so how long is your study? Do you have a tag-along? I call it a tag-along. Maybe a type C study would be another way of referring to it. Extend the duration of the study to go beyond what was the primary endpoint for registration and to capture data that would reflect a continuum of service and care well beyond the point of randomization. Very excitingly, my last comment on this one is, what was the prior treatment effects on outcome? I've been watching some of the modeling literature. This is really neat. Now, we all know when we design studies, we really don't attend so much to how did the patient get here. Yes, we record concomitant medications, but it's cross-sectional, not longitudinal. We don't record the longitudinal data. How did you arrive at the point of randomization? Not just are you at the point of randomization. Maybe treatment history affects subsequent outcomes. Maybe that's an interesting subgroup. And so from an R&D perspective, the task is to first capture the data, which we're not actually fully capturing, prior to randomization. And in fact, if we thought about it just a little bit, maybe the randomization needs to be based on treatment sequence. How did you arrive? As much as what are you about to receive. Isn't that an exciting idea? And there's some parallels in other disciplines where that might be taking place. So now this is one we need to watch, because if you're starting out with the program today, well, you got a pretty long runway out there, 3 to 4 years before registration. And here's this, MACRA, the Medicare Access and Chip Reauthorization Act 2015. Well, what is it? Well, it's a way of physicians being paid for Medicare with both positive and negative pain adjustments. Will it impact the practice of medicine and heart failure? Well, too early to tell, but since 2/3 of the expenditures here are cardiovascularly related, I'm going to say yes. How might MACRA influence a practitioner's perspective and therefore the type of data we need to generate? I think is going to have a significant impact, because the physician will not be looking at the product in isolation. They'll be looking at the product in the context of all other types of care. So what we might anticipate as we roll out a plan? Site topology as a moderating effect. You know, as we all know, sites differ in the type of services they provide. In some respects, the site we want to demonstrate proof of concept is not going to be the site that we want to demonstrate value. It's a different system. Site topology is a moderating influence. Head-to-head comparison. Everyone would love that. We all know the risk of doing that and the potential advantages, but that's going to be, I think, a necessary part of the program. Education for compliance, I keep coming back to this. It's compliance that's driving variation, and variation is an anathema to individuals that are responsible for getting products on formulary. One of my favorite topics here is this interaction effects. Now, I don't mean the biostatistical type of interactions that we're all familiar with, although one could imagine that as well. I mean, how does your therapy play with other therapies, which may not be drug-related, actually, may not be drug-related. You know, for example, maybe cardiac rehabilitation efforts. Does your therapy enhance that or actually diminish its utility? How does it play with the other therapy? And importantly, increasing interest in looking at patient satisfaction. How is the experience of being treated, the gestalt, so to speak, of all the interventions that are taking place? Something on a radar screen to be aware of. So as we move forward with our challenges here, program design and strategy begins with regulatory, because as my good friend often tells me, you know, Mike, if the docs can't write the prescription, everything else you say doesn't matter much. So we need to get the approval. As hard as that is, we need to then start thinking about providers. Notice what I just did. I didn't say investigators, I said providers, the physicians, nurse practitioners, and so forth that are delivering care, then the patients and the payers. So here's some companion initiatives in heart failure. Risk stratification maneuvers. The ideas that Tony had for that biomarker stratification, doesn't that sound interesting? Things that would dictate prognostically things that would happen in the future. Nested studies, the need to place studies in certain settings to generate data that are unique to that setting, to permit you to ask a number of different questions, maybe that occur outside of the confines of your protocol. Episodes of care. episodes of care. In heart failure, it's all about the hospitalization. It is all about things happening before, happening during, happening 30 to 90 days thereafter. Administrative claims analysis, now not just that occurs through the access of those nice databases that many people have. I'm saying this, why not include in the informed consent an optional consent for an administrative claims analysis so that at the end of the study you have permission to go back and look at that particular patient's data before they were in the study, after they're in the study. You get the idea of it. Building a dossier of information about all the different inputs that took place there. And here's another one that's near and dear. All of us know when we have a screen fail patient, it represents a loss of revenue to the sponsor, loss of opportunity for the site. Rather than letting that patient go, so to speak, why not enroll that screen failure patient in a concurrent longitudinal cohort study, an observational study that will have much less constraints and visit structure, type of therapy, heck, any physician they want to see. It's all grist for the mill. You're creating a companion database of individuals who were close to the individuals that were actually in your trial, giving you an opportunity to do some really neat things that we're all familiar with through propensity score analyses as an example, to make a statement about a concurrent control group in terms of utilization. So final slide here, just to give you a summarize. So we want, at the end of mind, need to create an evidence-based value program. The questions we're asking ourselves is, what is your regulatory and peer-reviewed data of mix? Most of the payers I speak to will begin with the regulatory approval, but they are receptive to well-designed, well-reviewed studies for consideration. What is the population likely to use the product? Perhaps it's not the one that you actually used in your study. Did you include patients in what I call the deep end of the swimming pool? All those comorbidities and concomitant medications that we systematically exclude. How will physicians actually use it? Or are they going to use it with a number of other companion therapeutics? And what are the outcomes associated with that therapy? How does your therapy interact with the other therapy? The interaction effects, and did you miss data such as quality of life, which is increasingly important? The bottom line to conclude this part of our talk is, how does your product introduction affect the healthcare system? And the exciting thing about this is that methodological rigor, not the source of funding, determines if the data will be acknowledged. I think this is the ultimate expression of a translational research, the translational being from development to commercialization. With that, we're going to close. We do have time for a few questions. I want to take a poll first. So Colleen, if we could put up the poll questions, I just want to see how people feel about these things. Okay. So here's one that we started out with, the value-based orientation. So I'd like to ask you, what is the likely impact of a value-based orientation on research and development? Do you think that it stifles innovation? Do you feel that it encourages innovation? Or maybe not enough experience or data to judge? If you could please respond to one. There we go. Oh, I'm so glad. I have to say that's the answer I was hoping for. It really pushes the envelope across the board so that we have a much more comprehensive feeling for how to introduce these compounds. Now, Colleen, I see we've got some questions here. How about taking one or two? Let's see what's out here. Yeah. Colleen, do we have a question? If you could, if I don't see it here. Okay.
Yes, so the first question, how does the CRO contribute beyond the typical contributions you expect from an operational organization?
All right, Tony, how about taking a crack at that one?
Sure. So the typical CRO, actually there are no typical CROs anymore, but people typically think about a CRO in terms of its operational capacity. So its ability to deploy clinical research associates, clinical trial assistants, have a project manager, etc. operationally, as well as engage your sites, pick and choose your sites, manage your sites, data management, and things such as this in the operational armamentarium to conduct a trial. But many CROs have other capabilities as well. So for instance, you can also, as I mentioned in the presentation, you can also have CROs that, that can perform a lab analysis, even a complex laboratory analysis. You can have some CROs who can do their own imaging, either echo, MRI, or a carotid, intimamedial thickness, ultrasound imaging assessment, and on and on. Or you can have the CRO that is a little bit more non-traditional with their physician group that they use not just as medical monitors, but more importantly as consultants to the pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies to help strategically design the overall drug development program, as well as position it into a space where it can both be approved quicker, potentially with few lower costs, and designed in an alternative way so that it doesn't significantly impact the sponsor negatively in terms of time, cost, and sample size. So there are many different ways that a CRO can interact with the client to develop their drug development program, and operational is the most obvious way of thinking of it, but there are many more ways to strategically work with that client. Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say you want a strategic relationship, not a transactional one. You know, when the CRO business first began 20 years ago, and many of us were around then, it was a different business in so many ways. Now the science is so elegant, the clinical phenotypes are so nuanced and special, the questions that need to be answered are so diverse and complex. The group that should be assembled, in my opinion, is, you know, multidisciplinary, highly integrated, kind of rotating leadership, if I may put it that way. It mirrors in many respects the project teams that many of you in pharma are quite familiar with. A group of people that are engaged from first in human all the way to registration to sort through all these diverse issues. Very strategic, not transactional. Here's a great question, Colleen. What is your best endpoint for assessing value? Wow. After 17 years of doing this, I have no answer, because I used to imagine I understood what the issues were in any given space, you know, but the truth is, rarely is that the case. The endpoints that are most important will likely vary appreciably by the stakeholder who's asking the question. The way I would say it is that there's a multiplicity of endpoints that are required to engage different stakeholders. A key opinion leader in cardiac imaging is going to have a very different demand than someone that has to manage inpatient pharmacy costs, if I can use that as an example. So putting together a group to first understand the question, what is the question? What is the most important question, and when should it be introduced, is the best method of engagement, because these outcomes vary appreciably, and as you might imagine, materially affect the scope of the program, how long it takes to complete it, the cost, a whole bunch of other variables. How about another one, Carl? Go ahead, please.
I was going to say, great concept, Mike. And if I can elaborate on that a little bit more, just from my own experience, when you think about the endpoints, you don't want to just think about that one trial, because as Mike said, the endpoints will be based on the information that the payer or the regulatory agency will be looking at, or the actual physician who's out there practicing. they will have a specific amount of information, a specific type of information that they're looking at that may or may not be satisfied by that one study. So you want to think of it in terms of an overall development program. One study may be able to respond to the information requested or desired by the regulatory agencies, but then you'll need another study, say a phase 3B or even phase 4 study to get the information needed for the payers, and then even another study needed for information that'll be desired for the physicians. And if I can just use this sacubitril/valsartan story again, the phase 3 study obviously was designed to have a significant impact on the regulatory agencies, but it also had several endpoints that were specifically designed to give the information needed for the payers. But what they didn't realize later in the drug development program was that they needed a little bit more information for the actual physicians that are prescribing the drug. So they came up with a phase 3B study designed to give that information on how to start the patient on sacubitril/valsartan, specifically to assist the physicians prescribing this agent.
Very
So
nice, Tony.
I would say it's an overall
Nice.
drug development programs. Go ahead. Yes.
You're developing information, not just a drug. Now, I see, Tony, we're over our time here, and there's some really great questions here. In fact, they're very provocative questions. May I encourage everyone to please send the questions, because some of these would take a little bit of thought process to answer. We'll try to address them. We hope you've enjoyed it. It's been very enjoyable for us, as you can tell, to speak to you. We appreciate your attention. We hope we have a chance to work with you in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank
you. Thank you. This concludes today's webinar. As Dr. Murphy mentioned, if you did ask a question that we did not get to, we will reach out to you individually. This webinar has been recorded, and all attendees will receive a link to the on-demand either tomorrow or Monday. For more information about Worldwide, we invite you to visit worldwide.com. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar and have a wonderful rest of the day.